Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com with Peepo, here to talk to you about 7 fabulous modern, some of them very recent, harp concertos. And although Peepo is an R&B cat, as I've said before, she's not particularly interested in classical music. She will make an exception for harp music, which I think is absolutely fascinating. You know, she has exquisite taste for, an animal of her stature and type, I must say. And even in R&B, she's very, very picky. So anyway, we want to talk about harp concertos, and I'd like to spend a little time talking about the harp. And you probably would like to be someplace else by now, right? So let me let you do that. It's a good girl. Thank you. Okay. So, the harp. We're going to talk about the harp. A fascinating, often misunderstood instrument, even by composers who wrote for it pretty extensively. The harp, as we know it, the modern harp, is an amazing piece of mechanical construction. It has over 2,000 parts, many of them moving parts. And what most people don't realize is that although it has 47 strings and a range of something like 6.5 octaves, each of those strings is connected to a pedal. There are 7 pedals. Each pedal has 3 positions. So playing the harp involves as much footwork as it does finger work. And each single type of string is its own pitch class. For example, all of the C strings on the harp can be altered by the C pedal to become either a C sharp or a C flat. So each string has 3 different notes that it can play a half step apart. And as a result of that, you can play foreign notes in different keys. You can play in every key, first of all, and you can play different notes in different keys that are foreign to that key by raising and lowering the pedal. But you're limited. You're limited in the fact that although our modern scale has 12 notes, what we call the chromatic scale, has 7 notes which define a basic key and 5 which are outside that key. If you want to look at it that way, it's like the white keys on a piano and the black keys on a piano. And the pedals on the harp get you the black keys, basically. But you can only have 7 in a scale. So, for example, when harps make glissandos, they do this thing, you're only going to get 7 notes in a scale, no matter what key you're in or what you want to do. Harps cannot play chromatic scales, although there were chromatic harps that were invented in the early days of the 20th century and which were dismal failures. So it's possible to do it, but that's not the way it worked out. So the modern harp needs to be written for in a very, very skilled and careful way, because there are certain notes, if you're in a key, that just aren't there, and you have to try and get them by playing around with the pedals. But when you play around with the pedals, you change all of the notes on the harp that belong to that pitch class. And so harp notation is very tricky, and a lot of composers don't know how to do it wrong, or don't care. I mean, Wagner's harp parts in, the Rainbow Bridge scene in Das Rheingold, there are 6 harps. They're famously impossible. Prokofiev's harp parts are basically just piano parts written for a harp. I was looking at a critical edition of Janáček's Katja Kabanova, the opera. There's a wonderful note that's in the Revisionsbericht, the notes to the revision and the correction of the score that say Janáček's harp parts are just impossible. It's up to the player to figure out and approximate what they think he wanted to do. And this is a common problem. Harpists have to spend a lot of time looking at especially orchestral parts and correcting them to see if they're playable at all, and if they are, how much of it they're going to play. And I've had discussions about this with harpists on numerous occasions. It's really kind of fascinating. Now, a modern concert harp, aside from being extremely large and expensive, and it weighs about 100 pounds and has all of these moving parts, and it makes an extraordinarily beautiful sound. I mean, it's actually a very, very expressive instrument. So are harpists, actually, and you've the only thing more fascinating than the sound of a harp is the sound of a harpist if you drop their harp. Because I've heard that too, and it was quite an extraordinary noise, believe me, understandably so. Now, one of the fascinating things about the harp is that the modern one, the one that we have now, the concert harp, was invented around 1810 by the French firm of Erard, which was also a very, very famous piano manufacturer. Liszt played their piano. And their harp had 8 pedals. And the 8th pedal was, believe it or not, a vibrato pedal. Because, one of the bits of evidence I was looking into to talk about, the use of vibrato in the 19th century orchestra and in various instruments, and to show that the historically informed performance people have no clue what they're talking about on this subject, is that even instruments that are not capable of doing pitch vibrato were given devices to approximate it. And in the harp's case, it was the 8th pedal. Now, what the 8th pedal did was it opened a shutter in the body of the instrument, that big thick post that's closest to the harpist. And by opening and closing this thing and wiggling it back and forth, you could create a certain intensity vibrato, a sort of wah, wah, wah in the sound. It's very similar to the tremulant device that you find in organs, which is it's not pitch vibrato. It's not an oscillating pitch. It's rather an oscillation of intensity caused by changing the rate at which either the wind goes into the pipes, or in this case, the resonant qualities of the harp itself. That pedal soon, fell into disuse for the obvious reason that it's useless in an orchestra, in a large hall, in a large orchestral setting. At very, very best, it was going to make a very, very minimal effect on the instrument, which would only be noticeable in small rooms where you were sitting next to the harpist, basically. And the Comtesse de Genlis, who wrote one of the seminal harp treatises in the early days of the 19th century, pointed out that the 8th pedal is not helpful for lady harpists because their voluminous clothing would get in the way of this thing opening and closing and get all tangled up. And so it probably wasn't much of a good idea. And anyway, it fell out of fashion. But it's just an interesting little tidbit about how desperate instrument manufacturers and performers were to try and make their instruments vocally expressive. And by that means adding vibrato. So let's talk about harp concertos. So modern composers are always looking for interesting things to do, and modern instrumentalists particularly need repertoire. And although there are earlier harp concertos, there were a lot of them in the classical period by composers like Krumpholz, and remember Handel wrote one, but those were for much more primitive harps, and the music written for them was much, much simpler. In the Romantic period, there's the Boieldieu harp concerto, which is extremely lovely, and there's the Reinecke harp concerto, which is also very, very nice, but there's very little. There's very little because you had larger Romantic orchestras, and harps were sort of entering into the orchestra at that point. Spohr's wife was a harpist, and some of his best chamber music was written for harp and violin. But in terms of orchestral works, concerti, there aren't very many of them. They are really a 20th century phenomenon because you had the rise of virtuoso harpists. People like Ossian Ellis in the UK. Benjamin Britten wrote his harp parts for him, and there were concertos written for him, and we're going to talk about one of them. A wonderful player who really provided the inspiration for composers to write for his instrument along with the orchestra. Modern orchestration, too, with its emphasis on unique sounds and its variety of sounds and textures, has been very kind to the harp. So I want to talk about some pieces. Let's start with a very, very recent one. This is the Harp Concerto by Jennifer Higdon, which is really, really a lovely work in 4 movements, about 20 minutes long. There's an excellent recording of it. It's played by Yolanda Condonassis, and she's accompanied by the Rochester Philharmonic under Ward Stair on the Azica label. I reviewed it for ClassicsToday.com. It's a terrific piece, and it goes to show what you can do with the harp. It uses a little bit of extended harp technique, knocking on the instrument and doing some percussive things. But in all respects, it exploits all of the capabilities of the modern harp and shows you just how interesting and expressive an instrument it can be. two other concerti, which are fairly well known and have been recorded a few times, are the Glier Harp Concerto. Glier, was a composer of sort of he was somewhat very traditional in his harmonic and orchestral palette. He was a romantic, and a harp concerto was just the thing for a guy like him. But also Ginastera. Alberto Ginastera wrote a wonderful harp concerto, which is famous for having problems of balance between the orchestra, which can be a little excessively enthusiastic, and the solo instrument. But here's a fine disc on Chandos with Rachel Masters playing the harp with the City of London Symphonia under Richard Hickox that gives you both of those concertos. Just looking at the album there, I'm going to put it down. So, that's a wonderful way to get to know two modern harp concerti in very different styles. I mean, Ginastera doesn't sound anything like Glier. So, if you're getting into harp concertos, that's a nice place to start. However, one composer who wrote absolutely fantastic harp music, and I'm going to actually play you a little bit of it because it's beautiful, it's very beautiful, is Rodrigo. Rodrigo is known for one work, the Concierto de Aranjuez, but Naxos did a 8 or 9 disc survey of his complete orchestral works. There's really quite a bit, and most of them are concertos. He was the last in that great school of Spanish nationalist composers. Some would say he was the least, but his music's very attractive, and his harp concerto, the Concerto Serenata, is wonderful. It's an absolutely beautiful piece and way too little known. I'm going to play you a little bit of it. Listen and you'll see what I mean. That was Gwyneth Wentick on the harp with the Asturias Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Maximiano Valdez. A beautiful work, the Rodrigo Harp Concerto, and this particular disc contains all of his music for harp, including a transcription of the Concierto de Aranjuez, which is quite lovely, and his piece Sones en la Giralda, the Fantasia Sevillana for harp and orchestra, which is also just a lovely work. So if you're looking for some beautiful 20th century music, this is the Rodrigo edition, Volume 9. Wow. Volume 9 is complete orchestral music on Naxos, and it's definitely worth exploring. Another wonderful harp disc, and it's also on Naxos, I'll play you a sample, is William Alwyn, Lyra Angelica. This was written for, I believe, Ossian Ellis. Yes, probably. Who knows? Because he was in England. And it's a concerto for harp and string orchestra. It's in 4 pretty substantial movements. I mean, the piece, let's see, 7 plus 6 plus 7 is 14, 20, 25, 27 minutes. It's a major work, a major statement by a very good composer. I don't know how much you know of William Alwyn. His symphonies are worth hearing. He wrote an opera called Miss Julie, which is absolutely miserable, and it's just been re-recorded for Chandos. It's Strindberg's play about miserable people behaving badly, and all I can say is that Alwyn's music is absolutely appropriate to the subject. It's as miserable as the people and their behavior. Avoid it. But his orchestral and instrumental music is really quite lovely, and Lyra Angelica is a case in point. Here, have a listen. Terrific, isn't it? It's absolutely wonderful. That was Suzanne Willison, excuse me, on the harp with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic under David Lloyd Jones. It's absolutely wonderful. A wonderful, wonderful piece. And, it's been recorded 3 times. There's a version on Chandos. There's also a version on Lyrita with the composer conducting. Now, there are 2 other modern harp concertos that I want to consider, one of which is the excellent harp concerto by Uhani Rautavara, the wonderful Finnish composer. We've already discussed his Cantus Arcticus. Now, he wrote 12 concertos, including a beautiful harp concerto. It's on Ondine, and you can get it coupled to his 8th Symphony, or you can get it in this excellent box of all of the Raltavara concertos. And they are, let me see, there's a violin concerto, the cello concerto, a double bass concerto, Angel of Dusk. Ooh, yes. There's also a ballade for harp and strings, which is absolutely beautiful. Then there's the concerto for birds and orchestra that I played you already, Cantus Arcticus. There's a flute concerto, a clarinet concerto, an organ concerto, and 3 piano concertos. So that's a serious concerto composer, and it's definitely worth hearing his music. All of these pieces, they're terrific. Finally, there is a harp concerto that is as good as unknown, that is, I think, one of the most beautiful works for the instrument ever created, and it deserves to be a repertory piece. It's absolutely wonderful, and that's the Harp Concerto by William Matthias. It's an absolutely gorgeous work. It was written for Ozzy and Ellis. It's only been recorded twice that I'm aware of. There's this version conducted by David Atherton with Ozzy and Ellis playing the harp on Lyrita. And there's also a version on Koch that's coupled to the Ginastera harp concerto. There's a certain incestuous relationship between all of these harp concertos. Matthias was a wonderful composer, a really, really fine composer. He died fairly young. His years are 1934 to 1992. He's best known, I think, for a lot of his choral music. But he wrote wonderful, wonderful instrumental music. And this disc actually contains his clarinet concerto and his piano concerto number 3, which is also terrific. I mean, these are very, very fine pieces, but this harp concerto is great. You can sing it. You can hum it. The finale goes dum ba da 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 ba da ba da ba da ba da ba da 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 ba da. Now, if that doesn't sell you, I don't know what will. In any case, I just hope this little chat has given you a sense of how much marvelous music there is out there for instruments which formerly were not usually featured. And unfortunately, we don't see these things performed very often. It really kind of depresses me because I would go. I mean, I know other people maybe wouldn't. Unfortunately, harp virtuosi are not the ones who, tend to draw huge audiences to concerts like violinists and pianists. But, a piece like the Rodrigo, the Concerto Serenata, is so beautiful. And harps tend to balance a heck of a lot better with modern orchestras than guitars do. I mean, they can make quite a volume. As you know, if you've ever heard a Mahler symphony with 2 harps, winging away underneath the orchestra, you know that they really do penetrate and they can make an incredibly rich and full sound when opposed to the orchestra. I happen to think the Concierto de Aranjuez works a lot better on a harp than it does on a guitar. So, do explore these beautiful, beautiful works. They make wonderful additions to your collection, and I think you may find yourself listening to them quite frequently because they offer a lot musically. They have real substance. They're not just frou-frou, light, gallant or kind of, silliness music, light, fluffy background music. They are serious works, major works, fabulously written that treat the instrument seriously and effectively integrate it into colorful and imaginative orchestration with like lovely sonorities and some great tunes and really evocative textures. I mean, the harp is particularly well suited for contemporary music in the sense that a lot of contemporary music is not melodic. It's based on texture. And the harp is the texture instrument par excellence, right? I mean, it just makes wonderful, liquid, gorgeous textures that can sound blend beautifully with all kinds of other orchestral sonorities. It's very hard to make a harp concerto sound gnarly and nasty, although I know that some modern composers have tried. In fact, I have to tell you one last story before we go. Back in my community orchestra days, we wanted to do Mahler's Ninth Symphony, and we actually were able to do Mahler's Ninth Symphony. However, you need two harps, right? And the principal harpist was a wonderful, wonderful player, and she insisted that in exchange for her services, she would come and play the harp part for free if we allowed her to do a tribute to her harp instructor, who was the great French harpist Marcel Grangenie. And he wrote a harp concerto. And we said, okay, fine, you want to do it, fine. But then, of course, because the strings and the harp, it was for harp and strings, got to do something, all the wind players wanted something that they could do. So they wanted to do Mendelssohn's Wind Band Overture, which is a wonderfully trashy piece, and I like it because I get to play in it. It's got percussion. And so we decided to do that. And that with Mahler Ninth, all of that. But what we didn't know was that the Grangenie Concerto for Harp and Strings, it's endless. It's like more than half an hour long. It goes on forever. And it's ugly. It's ugly, ugly, ugly. He was a composer in the school of, who was the guy? Not Duruflé, the other French guy, Dupré, Marcel Dupré. That ugly, chromatic, sort of late Vierne, gnarly French, post-Frankian, not serial, but just nasty style. And believe it or not, you can write for the harp in that style. It takes a lot of pedal work to get those chromatic notes in there, but you can do it if you know how and if you're a harpist. And so she played this piece that went on and on and on and on. It was horrible. And so we did the Mendelssohn and this horrible, interminable harp concerto. And then after intermission, we did Mahler 9. And I swear to God, these were free concerts on Sunday afternoons and, mostly attended by senior citizens, some of whom I think didn't make it. They gave it up halfway through. It's such a shame. But those are the joys of working in a community orchestra. And these harp concertos, the ones I've told you about, are all fantastic and wonderfully worth your time and attention. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you and take care.